Every institution that handles power has to answer a question it never wants to ask. Who polices the police? There is no clean answer. There is the Oversight Board, the Internal Affairs Division, the Civilian Complaint Process, the Prosecutor's Office that theoretically operates independently of the law enforcement agencies it depends on for evidence and support. There is the partner, the colleague who shares the cruiser, the briefing room, the morning coffee, the person who, by nature of proximity alone, is the closest observer of what their fellow officer actually does and actually is. The cases in today's episode are about that last mechanism of accountability, the internal one, the human one, the one that works not through formal process but through the slow, unsettling accumulation of feeling that something is wrong with the person you work beside. The cases where colleagues noticed, where patrol partners piece things together, where the machinery of law enforcement eventually turned on one of its own, not because the institution had the integrity to investigate itself quickly, but because the crimes were too large to remain invisible forever, and the evidence eventually reached people whose job was to follow it wherever it led, even when it led somewhere that changed everything they thought they knew about the person in the next desk or the next uniform. 4 stories today. In 3 of them, the killer operated for years, sometimes for decades, inside a law enforcement environment that theoretically should have caught them sooner. They used the knowledge, the access, the credibility, and the cover that the badge provided. They understood how investigations worked because they had helped run investigations. They knew what evidence looked like and how to limit it. They knew the rhythms of a police response and how to stay one step outside them. And in each case, what eventually ended it was not a dramatic moment of revelation from a partner with the courage to speak. It was something quieter and more methodical, evidence that could not be wished away, DNA that could not be argued against, patterns that became impossible to ignore once someone looked at them with fresh eyes, and no institutional loyalty clouding the picture. The question of why it took so long, why colleagues sometimes protected, sometimes disbelieved, sometimes simply failed to see what was there to be seen, is a question that runs underneath all 4 of these stories. It is not an easy question. The answer to it implicates not just individual officers, but the particular psychology of institutions built on the assumption of trust, on the idea that the person in uniform is already vetted, already proven, already on the right side of things. What happens when that assumption is wrong? What happens when the person whose job it is to catch killers is the killer? Welcome to Mind Behind the Crime. Times. Story 1. The Call to the Sheriff. Gerard John Schaefer, Martin County, Florida, 1972 to 1973. On the afternoon of July 22, 1972, the newly appointed sheriff of Martin County, Florida, received a phone call from one of his deputies. The deputy's name was Gerard Schaefer. He was 26 years old. He had been on the force for a matter of months, still building the record that would eventually carry him to whatever career in law enforcement he had imagined for himself. And he was calling, in what his boss later described as a tone that was somewhere between apologetic and evasive, to explain that he had done something foolish, that he had overdone the job, that he had been trying to teach 2 young women a lesson about the dangers of hitchhiking, and had perhaps taken the lesson a little further than he should have. He said he had left them at Hutchinson Island, a wooded barrier island off the Atlantic coast. He said they were restrained. Sheriff Robert Crowder and Lieutenant Melvin Waldron were in a patrol car within minutes. They drove at speed along State Highway A1A, the coastal route that runs the length of Hutchinson Island. And coming toward them on the highway, running, stumbling, her clothes torn, her wrists bound behind her back with handcuffs, a cloth gag still hanging around her neck, was one of the women. Her name was Nancy Trutter. She was 18 years old. Her friend Paula Wells, 17, was found shortly after, in similar condition, deeper in the swamp. Both of them had been bound to trees. Both of them had nooses around their necks. When they escaped, loosening their restraints during a window when Schaefer left them to answer a radio call, they ran toward the highway and toward the officers who were already racing in their direction. The call Schaefer made and what it revealed. The act of calling his own supervisor was, from any strategic standpoint, a mistake. Schaefer was already free and clear. The women were tied up in a remote swamp that was difficult to reach. He could have said nothing. He could have disposed of the situation in the manner he had apparently disposed of other situations before. But he called. He reported himself. He handed his boss the beginning of a chain of evidence that would eventually unravel everything. The reason, in retrospect, seems to be something that appears again and again in the documented behavior of people who operate inside institutions they believe will protect them, an overconfidence born of authority. Schaefer had used the badge to get those women into his car. He had called into his station on his police radio when he picked them up, announcing casually that he had 2 girls and was going to take them home. The station had cleared him. He had been, in his own mind, supervised and sanctioned the whole time. The institution was supposed to provide cover, and now he was calling on the same institution, explaining the situation in the blandest possible terms, expecting, on the basis of the same overconfidence, that the cover would hold. It didn't. Not this time. Crowder fired him that same afternoon. He was charged with aggravated assault and false imprisonment. The case seemed, for a moment, contained a wayward deputy who had badly misjudged the situation, who had been fired and charged and was now out of law enforcement entirely. The problem was the bail. 50 days after the bail, after being charged, Schaefer posted $15,000 bail and was released pending trial. His sentencing date was set for December. He had 50 days of freedom between his release and his court date. On September 27, 1972, 2 months after Trotter and Wells escaped, Susan Place, 17, and Georgia Jessup, 16, left Fort Lauderdale with a man they had introduced to Susan's mother as a friend named Jerry Shepard. Susan's mother, Lucille Place, noticed something that mothers notice. She wrote down the license plate number of his car as it drove away. Her daughter and her daughter's friend were never seen alive again. Schaefer appeared in court in December 1972 and accepted a plea arrangement on the earlier charges, 1 count of aggravated assault, with a sentence of 1 year and the possibility of parole after 6 months. He was in jail, technically, when investigators began trying to trace the car whose plate Lucille Place had written down. It came back to Schaefer, his blue-green Datsun. In April of 1973, a father and son collecting aluminum cans in the dense scrub of Hutchinson Island, the same island where Trotter and Wells had been held, found human remains beneath a tree. The bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition. Evidence of restraint was still present. So were marks on the bones consistent with extreme violence. So were shallow burial marks in the earth around them, indicating that the bodies had been placed deliberately and then partially uncovered by animals. Investigators linked the site to the location where the first 2 women had been bound. They identified the remains as Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The license plate number that Lucille Place had written down when her daughter walked out the door had been sitting in the case file the entire time. Now it connected. The search and what it found. A search warrant was executed on the home Schaefer shared with his mother in Fort Lauderdale. What investigators found inside created a case that went far beyond the 2 murders they were building toward. There were personal items, jewelry, identification documents, keepsakes, belonging to women whose disappearances had been reported in various counties across South Florida over the preceding years. There were handwritten materials, stories and sketches and descriptions that law enforcement personnel and prosecutors who reviewed them described as among the most disturbing documents they had seen in their careers, not fictional in any meaningful sense, but written in the voice of a perpetrator describing acts against women in specific, detailed, organized language that read as documentation more than imagination. There were also weapons, items that should have been in evidence rooms at police stations. Items that had crossed the line from law enforcement storage into the personal collection of a man who had known exactly where to find them. Schaefer was convicted at trial in October 1973 of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Place and Jessup. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. During the sentencing proceeding, the prosecutor described him as the most sexually deviant individual he had encountered in his career in law enforcement. Investigators estimated, based on the recovered personal items and the written materials, that Schaefer was likely responsible for the deaths of somewhere between 20 and 30 women across South Florida, women who had been reported missing, women whose cases were in files in various county offices, women whose families had been living for years with the uncertainty of not knowing. Most of those cases were never formally resolved. Most of those families never received the direct answer they deserved. The institutional failure that can't be undone. The detail that is easiest to lose in the legal chronology of the Schaefer case is this. He was a serving law enforcement officer when the first 2 women escaped and ran to a colleague on the highway. The sheriff who took his call and fired him the same day made the correct decision. But the decision that followed, The bail hearing, the $15,000 bond, the months between arrest and sentencing, was made not by the sheriff but by a court system that extended to a charge deputy the same procedural rights it extends to any defendant, which is as it should be, which is also how he had 2 more months of freedom and used every day of them. The question of whether the system moved fast enough is separate from the question of whether any individual in the system failed. Most of them didn't. The sheriff acted immediately. The investigators who found the bodies and traced the license plate did their jobs. The prosecutors who tried the case were thorough. What the system could not do was give him bail. What it could not do was recover the time between the arrest and the sentencing during which he killed twice more. That is not an argument for denying bail to every charged officer. It is an argument for what it is, a tragedy that the system procedural architecture produced without any individual making a wrong decision, and that no amount of correct individual decision could prevent once the initial wrong decision, hiring him, had been made. Schaefer had sought psychiatric help years before becoming a police officer, reporting disturbing thoughts and violent fantasies. He had applied to become a priest and been turned away after his probationary period raised concerns. He had sought a career in law enforcement despite a record of indicators that, assessed carefully, would have disqualified him from position. The indicators were not assessed carefully. He was hired. Everything that followed is a direct consequence of that. 22 years and a cellmate's knife. Schaefer spent 22 years at Florida State Prison. He was not quiet. He filed appeals. He filed lawsuits, one against a true crime writer who had described him in unflattering physical terms, a lawsuit that was dismissed. He wrote letters to journalists, researchers, and former acquaintances, in which he sometimes acknowledged and sometimes denied the extent of what he had done. He wrote short stories, published through an arrangement with a former high school girlfriend-turned-true crime writer, that featured in nearly every entry a rogue police officer who targeted women. Stories he maintained were fiction, that prosecutors and investigators who read them described as something considerably less than fictional. He bragged in correspondence, toward the end of his time in prison, that he had impressed a fellow inmate with the scope of his crimes. The fellow inmate was Ted Bundy. On December 3, 1995, Gerard Schaefer was found on the floor of his cell at Florida State Prison. He had been stabbed more than 40 times. His attacker was a fellow inmate. No coherent motive was ever fully established. The violence of the attack, the number of wounds, the nature of them, spoke to something beyond a casual prison dispute. Sheriff Robert Crowder, the man who had received Schaefer's phone call on that July afternoon in 1972 and fired him the same day, died without ever having needed to doubt his own response to what Schaefer had told him. He had taken the right action. What he could not have done anything about was the $15,000 in bail money and the 50 days of freedom that followed, during which Gerard Schaefer used the time that the system gave him to kill 2 more people who never came home. Times. Story 2. The man everyone at the station knew. Drew Peterson, Bolingbrook, Illinois, 1977 to 2009. For 29 years, Drew Peterson was a police officer in Bolingbrook, Illinois. He was a presence in that department the way certain people become presences in institutions they have inhabited long enough, not just known but embedded, part of the institutional furniture, someone whose name and face and manner were so familiar to everyone around him that the idea of looking at him critically, of genuinely evaluating what the person behind the familiarity actually was, had become psychologically difficult in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who has never experienced it. He was funny, colleagues said, gregarious, the kind of person who made a room feel warmer. He was also, during those same 29 years, a man who told multiple women he married, women he was in relationships with, that he could kill them and make it look like an accident. Who told at least one of them exactly how he would do it? Who told another that he could snap a person's neck without leaving a mark? Who said these things not in moments of rage, but in the calm, matter-of-fact tone of someone who wanted to be understood to have a capability, who wanted the knowledge of what he could do to function as a form of control? The question that lingers over 29 years of his police career is not whether his colleagues knew him. It is whether knowing him, in the sense that long institutional familiarity produces, made it impossible to know the truth about him. Kathleen Savio, the third wife. Kathleen Savio was 40 years old when a body was found in the dry bathtub of her home on March 1st, 2004. The house was in Bolingbrook. Her hair was soaked. A 2-inch gash marked the back of her skull. The bathtub contained no water. She and Drew had been married for 12 years and had spent the last 2 of those years working through a contentious divorce. The divorce proceedings had reached a point where financial settlement was imminent, a settlement that would have required Drew to pay a significant sum to Kathleen from their shared assets. The settlement hearing was scheduled for the following week. She never attended it. The first responding officers found the scene and made a determination that has been examined and re-examined in the years since. They concluded, within hours, that her death appeared to be an accident. The coroner's jury that convened shortly after reached the same conclusion, an accidental drowning. Despite the absence of water and the presence of a head wound, and despite bruising on her body that was documented in the autopsy and then essentially set aside. Among the things that happened in the immediate aftermath, Drew Peterson, still an active duty police sergeant in the same department whose officers had just responded to his ex-wife's home, called the locksmith who had been dispatched to perform the welfare check, reaching him on his personal cell number rather than going through official dispatch channels, as would have been standard. He arrived at the scene in uniform. He was present in the early stages of the investigation. He was in the peculiar institutional space created by his status, simultaneously a bereaved party to the situation and someone operating inside the official response to it. The coroner's jury included a police officer who knew Drew Peterson personally. That officer later acknowledged vouching for Peterson's character during deliberations, asserting, based on personal knowledge, that Drew was not the kind of man who would harm his ex-wife. The jury returned an accidental drowning verdict within days. Stacy Peterson, the 4th wife, October 28, 2007. Drew Peterson called police to report that his 4th wife, 23-year-old Stacy Peterson, was missing. He said she had phoned him to let him know she was leaving him for another man. He said she had made the call and then disappeared entirely, leaving behind her children, her family, her entire life. He said he wasn't worried about her because he believed she had simply chosen to go. Stacy's family did not believe it for a day. Her father, her sister, the people who had known her before she married Drew Peterson and throughout the marriage, went immediately and publicly to investigators with a different account. That Stacy had been frightened of Drew, that she had spoken in the weeks before her disappearance about things she had seen and known that put her in a position of significant danger. That she had told a family member, a pastor she trusted, that she believed Drew had killed Kathleen Savio. That she had described helping him the night of Kathleen's death in a way that placed her directly in the middle of a story that, if it ever became formally established, would end everything Drew Peterson had built. She had also been talking to a divorce attorney. The paperwork was in progress. Drew Peterson gave interviews. He appeared on news programs. He suggested contests. A win a date with Drew promotion, offered to reporters with the breezy confidence of a man who either did not grasp the gravity of the public perception of him or grasped it completely and had decided that performance was the best available defense. He was, throughout the media attention that followed Stacy's disappearance, aggressively present, aggressively unconcerned. The second autopsy and the reclassification. The Illinois State Police and the FBI formally reopened the investigation into Kathleen Savio's death in November 2007, weeks after Stacy's disappearance. Her body was exhumed. A forensic pathologist who had no prior connection to the case or to Peterson was brought in to conduct a second examination of the remains. The second examination reached a different conclusion. The pathologist found evidence consistent with a physical struggle, signs that Kathleen had fought before her death, signs that were inconsistent with an accidental fall and drowning. The manner of death was formally reclassified from accident to homicide in February 2008. Drew Peterson was named as a prime suspect. He was not arrested immediately. The investigation that followed was complicated by the specific nature of the evidence available. There was no physical evidence tying Drew to the scene. No fingerprints. No DNA. No witness who had seen him at Kathleen's house that night. What there was, accumulated over weeks of interviews, were statements, things Kathleen had said to friends, family members, an assistant state's attorney she had contacted 2 years before her death begging for an emergency protection order, things Stacy had said to her pastor and to family members. A pattern of statements from women who had been close to Drew Peterson, most of them delivered to people who had not been sure at the time whether they were legally obligated to report what they were hearing. Under standard rules of evidence, those statements would have been inadmissible hearsay, the account of what a deceased or missing person told someone else, filtered through memory and relationship and time. without the speaker present to be cross-examined. The Illinois State Legislature addressed this problem directly. In 2008, they passed a statute, discussed in legal circles ever since under the informal name Drew's Law, that created an exception to the hearsay rule for cases where investigators could demonstrate, by a preponderance of evidence, that the witness was unavailable because the defendant had caused their unavailability. The law was written with Peterson's case specifically in mind. Its passage was controversial. Its necessity was a direct consequence of the specific way in which his position in the community had, for years, limited the formal investigative record. The trial, the verdict, and what followed. Drew Peterson was arrested in May 2009 and held without bail. His trial began in the summer of 2012. The prosecution built its case almost entirely on what Kathleen and Stacy had told other people, their statements, preserved in the memories of family members, friends, and professionals who took the stand and testified about what they had been told and when. The defense argued that this was inherently unreliable, that hearsay filtered through grief and anger and hindsight was not evidence of murder. A key moment came when the defense itself called a divorce attorney who had met with Stacy Peterson shortly before her disappearance. Rather than undermining her credibility, which appeared to be the strategy, the attorney's testimony instead communicated to the jury something the prosecution had struggled to establish directly, that Stacy had been genuinely, specifically afraid of her husband, and that the fear had been grounded in knowledge, not suspicion. The jury deliberated. They returned guilty on all counts, first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. He was sentenced to 38 years in prison. He did not react as the verdict was read. Kathleen's sister, seated nearby, told him what she thought of his innocence claims in terms that were audible in the courtroom. 3 years after that sentencing, Peterson was convicted of a separate crime, attempting to arrange a murder of the prosecutor who had put him away. He had approached a fellow inmate and, in a conversation that was being recorded, asked how soon his contact's uncle could take care of the business in question. He received an additional 40-year sentence for that conviction. An Illinois appellate court subsequently ruled that Peterson would not receive his police pension. The court found that his murder of Kathleen Savio was directly connected to his service as a police officer, that he had used his specialized training, his knowledge of investigation procedures, his access to official channels, and his professional credibility to plan and cover up the crime. The pension board's language was precise about what the badge had meant in this case. Not incidental background, but active instrument. Drew Peterson is serving his sentence in Indiana. Stacy Peterson has never been found. There is a concept in organizational psychology called the halo effect of institutional membership, the documented tendency of people to extend positive assumptions to individuals based on the positive reputation of the group they belong to rather than the actual evidence of their individual character. In a police department, that effect is amplified by the specific nature of the membership. These are people who have been vetted, trained, badged, and trusted by the community. The assumption that the badge implies character is so foundational to how law enforcement functions that dismantling it, even in the face of accumulating evidence that something is wrong, requires a deliberate act of will that most institutional cultures are not built to support. The people who reported their concerns about Drew Peterson over the years, Kathleen in her letter to the state's attorney, the women who tried to file domestic complaints, were reporting into a system that struggled to hear them. Not always because the individuals in that system were corrupt. Sometimes simply because the halo was too bright. Times. Story 3. The Werewolf in Uniform. Mikhail Popkov, Angarsk, Siberia, 1992 to 2012. Angarsk is an industrial city in Siberia, roughly 40 kilometers from Irkutsk, surrounded by the vast and indifferent landscape of the Russian interior. It was built in the Soviet era to house workers for the oil and chemical plants that anchored the regional economy, and it carried into the post-Soviet period a particular atmosphere of such places, the compressed, collective quality of life in a company city, where everyone knows their neighbors and the rhythms of the day are shaped by the same industrial schedule that has been running for decades. It was also, beginning in the early 1990s, a city with a problem that no one initially understood as a single problem. Women were disappearing. Their bodies were turning up in the forest at the edges of the city, in roadside ditches, in wooded areas along the routes that connected Angarsk to neighboring communities. The violence done to them was extreme. The Russian tabloid press, which covered the cases as they accumulated, began to describe the unknown perpetrator as the werewolf and the Angarsk maniac. Those names communicated something about the nature of the crimes, their ferocity, their frequency, the apparent absence in whoever was doing this of anything that would pause at the damage they were leaving behind. The Angas police were investigating. They were constructing profiles. They were following leads. They were doing the work, as best they could, in a post-Soviet institutional environment that was chronically under-resourced, that was navigating the organizational chaos of the 1990s, and that was working a case whose geographic spread, the crimes eventually extended hundreds of kilometers in multiple directions, exceeded the practical capacity of any single jurisdiction to effectively pursue. Mikhail Popkov attended some of those investigations. As a serving police officer in the Angas force, he was present at scenes where his own crimes had been committed. He walked the ground he had already walked. He stood with colleagues who were looking for the werewolf while being the werewolf. He did this, according to the documented record, more than once. The double life. Popkov was born in 1964 and had joined the Irkutsk Region Police Force as a young man. By his own later account, and by the account of every colleague, neighbor, and family member interviewed in the course of the investigation, he was a model officer and a model family man. He was liked. He was respected. He was described in terms that virtually every post-mortem account of how a serial killer is perceived by the people around them will eventually produce: charming, reliable, attentive, the kind of person you would trust without hesitation, whose company you would actively seek out. He was married. He had a daughter. He coached model car building with her and met her from school. He was, within the confines of his home and his uniform, every surface element of the person the people around him believed they knew. Beginning in 1992, he drove at night in his police vehicle, in uniform, through the streets and bars and social spaces of Angarsk. He offered women rides. In a city where the alternative to accepting a ride from a uniformed officer could be a long walk alone in the Siberian winter, the offer was difficult to decline. He was the police. He was safe. He drove them to remote locations. The specific details of what followed are documented in court records and in Popkov's own extensive confessions, which he provided with a cooperation and a specificity that investigators who worked those sessions described as both invaluable and deeply disturbing. He described his justification, a belief that he was cleansing the city of women whose behavior he had judged immoral, a judgment he arrived at privately and applied with no external standard or accountability, in terms that revealed, to the psychologists who evaluated him, a complete absence of any genuine remorse or moral weight attached to what he had done. He was, forensic assessors determined, legally sane. He knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong in the eyes of the law and the world. He simply did not experience that wrongness as an obstacle. The tire tracks. For nearly 2 decades, the Angas investigation produced leads and eliminated them. A profile was developed. The perpetrator was likely a local, likely male, likely someone with familiarity with the geography of the surrounding forests and the patterns of local nightlife. Investigators noticed something about the physical evidence at multiple crime scenes. Tire tracks. A specific pattern of tire matched to the Lada 4x4, an off-road vehicle that was, at the time, used primarily by law enforcement agencies in the region. The tire track pattern was a data point. It was one among many. It was not acted on with the swiftness that, in retrospect, it deserved, in part because the post-Soviet investigative environment in Siberia in the 1990s was not resourced for the kind of systematic cross-referencing that would have immediately produced a short list of vehicles and their registered operators. It took years for the pattern to reach a point where it could be acted on with sufficient specificity. By then, Popkov had left the force. He had resigned in 1998 and moved into private security work at the Angarsk oil and chemical plant. He was no longer a police officer, but he was still driving at night. In 2012, the investigation was reopened with fresh resources and access to improved forensic technology. Investigators made a decision that was administratively enormous. They would conduct mandatory DNA testing of every current and former police officer who had served in the Irkutsk region. The number was approximately 3,500 people. This was not a decision made on the basis of a specific suspect. It was made on the basis of the tire track pattern, on the inference that whoever the werewolf was, they had access to law enforcement vehicles, and that the DNA samples that investigators had been preserving from crime scenes since the 1990s could be matched against a pool of people who fit that description. The interview, the sample, and the arrest. In March 2012, Mikhail Popkov was called in for an interview as part of the systematic process of contacting former officers. He was 4 to 7 years old. He was employed as a security guard. He had a wife and a grown daughter. He came to the interview without hesitation. He provided a DNA sample without hesitation. Investigators who were present in that room reported later that he appeared relaxed, cooperative, unbothered. The performance of a man who had maintained a double life for 20 years and had complete confidence in his ability to maintain it for 20 more. After the interview, he consulted a lawyer, and then he did something that would later be read as a first sign that the confidence had cracked. He packed his belongings and left Angarsk. He relocated to another city. He did not notify authorities of his new address. The DNA from his sample came back weeks after his departure. It matched. Not one crime scene. Multiple crime scenes. The DNA profile that investigators had been preserving from the 1990s, matching it against suspects for 20 years without result, had found its source. They tracked him down. He was arrested in June 2012 without incident. The arrest itself, no resistance, no dramatic confrontation, was consistent with everything else about the case. The double life had been conducted with total control for 2 decades. Now it was over, and he understood that it was over, and there was nothing left to perform. The confession and the scale of it. In custody, Popkov cooperated fully. He described his victims in organized, systematic detail. He led investigators to burial sites. He explained his methods and his reasoning. He expressed, in the sessions documented by investigators, no grief and no remorse. He smiled during interviews. He was reportedly calm and communicative in a way that the people working those sessions found, despite their professional training, profoundly difficult to manage. In 2015, he was convicted of 22 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. In 2017, he confessed to 59 additional murders. Subsequent investigations confirmed 56 of those confessions to a standard that the court accepted. In December 2018, he received a second life sentence. His daughter, speaking to Russian media after the first trial, said she still did not believe it. She described their relationship, the walks, the bicycle rides, the shared model car hobby, her father meeting her after school. She said he didn't fit any of the classifications she had read about in a book on how investigators catch serial killers. She said she wanted to be a criminologist. His wife and daughter eventually moved and built new lives in locations that were not publicly disclosed. Popkov is currently held at the Black Dolphin prison, one of Russia's highest security facilities. He is subject to 15 years of solitary confinement before any reduction in conditions. Russian investigators believe the total number of people he killed may exceed 83. He has not confessed to a precise final number and shows no indication of providing one. One investigator who worked the case, former detective Nikolai Kitaev, said after conviction that the department's failure to pursue the tire track evidence more aggressively was something the institution needed to honestly confront. That the assumption that the killer was an outsider, a metal worker, a driver, someone from the margins, had shielded a serving officer from the scrutiny that would have identified him years earlier. That the investigation had been looking outside when the answer was inside. Kitaev also noted that Popkov's wife's alibi for him had been accepted without sufficient scrutiny on at least 2 separate occasions during the investigation, that the word of a police officer's spouse, presented in the context of an investigation that was not yet looking at police officers as suspects, had been taken at face value in a way that delayed the process of elimination that might eventually have focused attention correctly. The systemic failures were not dramatic. They were bureaucratic, procedural, and fundamentally rooted in the assumption that the uniform stood for something that, in this case, it did not. Popkov said, in one of the prison interviews conducted by Russian investigators after his confessions, that he never anticipated the DNA technology that eventually caught him. He described himself as a product of another era, a time when what he did could be done without the forensic footprint that modern science would later find unavoidable. He was right about that in a narrow technical sense. He was wrong about everything else. The forensic science found him. The 3,500 DNA samples found him. And the institutional assumption that had shielded him, the tire tracks pointing toward law enforcement vehicles, reviewed and noted and then set aside, became, in retrospect, one of the most consequential investigative oversights in the documented history of serial crime. Times. Story 4. The ransacker on the Task Force Bridge are closing. Joseph DeAngelo, Exeter and Auburn, California, 1973 to 1979. We have covered the Golden State Killer in a previous episode, the full story of Joseph DeAngelo's 4 decades of crimes, the genealogy breakthrough that ended them, the sentencing and what the survivors said. We are not going to repeat that story here in full, but there is one specific detail of that case that belongs in this episode. One detail that sits at the center of today's theme like a point that everything else in the episode has been building toward. In the mid-1970s, the city of Visalia, California, was being targeted by a burglar who had committed more than 100 residential break-ins in a 3-mile radius. The crimes were methodical, specific, and utterly baffling to local investigators. The burglar selected targets with a precision that suggested knowledge of the neighborhood and the patterns of its residents that went beyond normal surveillance. He left minimal evidence. He varied his timing. He seemed to understand exactly how much time he had before a response would arrive. The Visalia Police Department formed a task force to find him. One of the officers assigned to that task force was a young police officer who had been stationed in Exeter, a neighboring community. He was reliable. He was knowledgeable. He was, by the accounts of the people who worked alongside him on the task force, a competent and professional presence. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo, and he was the Visalia ransacker they were looking for. He attended briefings about his own crimes. He reviewed evidence gathered from his own break-ins. He sat in rooms where investigators talked about the patterns and the methods of the unknown perpetrator, and he had the specific and unverifiable experience of hearing himself described from the outside, hearing what the investigation knew and what it didn't, what the evidence pointed to and what remained unclear, and used that knowledge to refine the way he operated. He left Visalia in 1976, moved to Sacramento, and the crimes escalated. He was a police officer the entire time. He committed crimes across 11 California counties while wearing a badge in one of them. The task force he sat on never identified him. He evaded detection for 4 to 4 years. The question his case raises, the same question that Schaefer and Peterson and Popkov raised, is not whether the badge provided cover. It clearly did. The question is how long the assumption of good faith, which is both necessary to make law enforcement function and catastrophically exploitable by people who have decided to exploit it, should be permitted to substitute for actual scrutiny. There is no clean answer. But every one of the cases in today's episode is an argument for asking the question honestly. Times. What the uniform concealed. 4 cases. For men who wore badges while doing things that the badge was supposed to prevent. The badge is not magic. It does not transform character. It is a piece of metal attached to a job that attracts, on the whole, people who genuinely want to serve, but that also attracts, in a smaller number of cases, people who want the access and the authority and the assumed legitimacy that the job provides without any of the moral foundation that is supposed to come with it. What the cases in today's episode have in common is not the crimes themselves. It is the mechanism of concealment, the uniform, the institutional identity that caused colleagues to extend the benefit of the doubt past the point where doubt had become reasonable. The professional credibility that made victims get into the car, trust a welfare check, accept the word of the man in uniform that everything was fine. The people who eventually broke through that concealment did not do it through dramatic confrontation. They did it through the slow, painstaking, methodical work of following evidence wherever it led. The forensic pathologist who read the second autopsy, the DNA analyst who matched the 3,500 sample, the genealogist who built a family tree from strangers' ancestry data, the prosecutor who fought for a new evidentiary law because the existing one couldn't hold the truth. None of them changed what the uniform had already hidden, but they changed what it could hide forever. Times. Which of today's 4 cases sat with you hardest, and what was a detail that shifted something in how you were thinking? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. If this episode gave you something real, share it with someone who thinks about these things too. I'll see you in the next one.